They called it Hitler's Buzzsaw, a single weapon that spat out 1,200 to 1,500 rounds per minute, nearly twice the rate of any Allied machine gun. Soldiers who heard its roar said it didn't sound like bullets. It sounded like someone tearing canvas apart with a giant, merciless saw. This was the MG42, the German machine gun that became the soundtrack of fear on every battlefield from 1942 onward. To the Allies, it was more than just a weapon. It was a psychological terror, a reminder that every advance, every step forward, might end in sudden death. On paper, the MG42 was efficient, designed to be mass-produced cheaply with stamped steel parts. But in reality, it was a monster. Its speed was so devastating that entire squads could be cut down in seconds. Veterans of Normandy, Monte Cassino, and the Eastern Front still recalled its terrifying chatter as the moment when blood ran cold and instincts screamed "take cover." But what most people don't know is that the MG42 wasn't just a weapon of war. It was a symbol, a machine that shaped German tactics, forced Allied innovation, and left a legacy so powerful that echoes of its design still live on in modern armies today. The story of the MG42 is not just about firepower. It's about fear, survival, and how one gun could change the rhythm of an entire war. And once you hear what it truly did on the battlefield, you'll understand why no sound was more dreaded than its ripping roar. The year was 1942. Europe was a continent in flames. From the frozen wastelands of Russia to the deserts of North Africa, entire armies clashed in battles of annihilation. In the West, Allied leaders were preparing for the inevitable return to mainland Europe. In the East, the German Wehrmacht faced the relentless Red Army across endless steppes where survival depended on firepower and endurance. Geography shaped everything. On the Eastern Front, vast open fields offered no cover, an infantryman's worst nightmare. In the Mediterranean, rocky hills and ruined towns turned every ridge into a fortress. And in northern France, hedgerows, villages, and open beaches created choke points where advancing soldiers would be fully exposed. Each of these landscapes demanded one thing: a weapon that could dominate space with sheer speed and volume of fire. For Germany, the stakes were immense. The Wehrmacht was stretched thin, fighting multiple enemies on multiple fronts. They needed weapons that could hold the line, weapons that multiplied the power of a single squad. For the Allies, every advance, whether across the dunes of Libya or the sands of Normandy, meant facing a storm of bullets that could rip apart formations in seconds. The MG42 was not born in isolation. It emerged from the brutal lessons of early war combat when the slower MG34, though deadly, proved too complex and fragile for the grinding battles ahead. The German answer was clear: create a weapon that was faster, tougher, and terrifying enough to change the psychology of war itself. This was the world into which the MG42 was unleashed, an arena where speed and survival were everything. And soon, its voice would echo across every battlefield, striking fear before the first bullet even found its mark. The birth of the MG42 began not on the battlefield, but in the offices of German weapons designers in the late 1930s. The Wehrmacht's doctrine demanded something radical: a machine gun that could serve as the backbone of every infantry squad, a weapon so fast and reliable that it could hold off enemies many times a unit's size. The first attempt was the MG34. Beautifully engineered, it was accurate and deadly, but it carried the curse of over-design. Machined from high-grade steel, it was expensive and time-consuming to produce. Worse, it jammed easily in mud, sand, and freezing cold, the exact environments Germany found itself fighting in. Commanders in Poland and France had praised its firepower, but by the time the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Russia in 1941, its weaknesses became fatal. The German High Command turned to industry for an answer. Metallurgists, engineers, and field officers demanded a new weapon, one that could be stamped from sheet steel, assembled quickly, and survive the brutality of war. The result was the Maskeningewehre 42, a weapon stripped of elegance but infused with savage efficiency. Training for the soldiers who would wield it was intense. Crews drilled endlessly: barrel changes, ammunition belt feeds, synchronized fields of fire. Every man knew his role: the gunner, the assistant gunner, the ammo carriers. The MG42 was not just a weapon, it was the beating heart of the German squad, and without coordination, it was useless. But when handled properly, it was a scythe. Yet there was a miscalculation lurking beneath the confidence. German intelligence believed the Allies, slow to adapt, reliant on older machine guns like the Bren or the Browning, would be shattered by the MG42's storm of fire. What they underestimated was the resilience of the men who would face it and the industrial might behind them. On the front lines, before the MG42 ever barked its first burst, the atmosphere was tense and deceptive. In the forests of Eastern Europe, soldiers listened to the quiet wind rustling through birch leaves. On the cliffs and coasts of France, villages lay silent, unaware that within months their fields would be drenched in fire. Even in the training grounds of Bavaria, where the first MG42s were tested, the silence before firing was unsettling, as if everyone present knew they were about to unleash something monstrous. And then, with the pull of a trigger, the world would hear a sound it had never heard before, a tearing, ripping fury that would change the very rhythm of combat. The battlefield was about to awaken. The first true test of the MG42 came not in a laboratory, but on the killing grounds of the Eastern Front. By the summer of 1942, the Wehrmacht had pushed deep into Soviet territory, but the war was dragging into something far more brutal than Berlin had imagined. Endless fields, blistering heat, choking dust, and swarms of determined Soviet infantry pressed against German lines day and night. It was here, dug into makeshift trenches and reinforced bunkers, that German machine gun crews first unwrapped their new weapon. The terrain seemed endless, a flat expanse where any movement was instantly visible, where cover was nothing more than a shallow ditch or a shattered tree. For Soviet soldiers, every advance meant sprinting across open ground, praying to close the distance before machine guns tore them apart. The MG42 was designed for this exact environment. Its barrels glowed red-hot after mere seconds of fire, but the crews, drilled to perfection, swapped them out in under 10 seconds. Soviet counterattacks, often massed in human waves, were shredded with terrifying speed. Survivors spoke of comrades falling so quickly it seemed as if an invisible blade had swept across the field. Yet the Soviets were not blind to the danger. They adapted, using smoke screens, night assaults, and scattered infiltration tactics. Snipers learned to target machine gun crews first, knowing that silencing the MG42 was the only hope of survival. Sometimes it worked. A well-placed bullet or mortar strike could take out a nest, giving attacking infantry precious seconds to surge forward. In those fleeting moments, Soviet soldiers felt the taste of victory, momentary, fragile, and bought with rivers of blood. Meanwhile, far to the west, the Allies were preparing for their return to occupied Europe. In North Africa, British and American troops advancing against the Afrika Korps encountered their first MG42s positioned in desert ridgelines. The harsh sun beat down on sandbags and dugouts, and as soldiers climbed rocky hills, the distinctive ripping sound cut through the dry air. At first, some thought it was artillery fire or even a new weapon entirely. Then the casualties mounted, and the grim truth became clear. They were facing something unlike anything they had trained for. Small victories came in the form of artillery barrages or daring flanking maneuvers. When a nest was destroyed, men cheered, relieved that the nightmare had been silenced, at least until the next burst ripped through the air from a different ridge. Each success felt hollow, for every gain was paid in blood. And as 1944 drew closer, one truth became undeniable. When the Allies finally landed on the beaches of France, they would face the MG42 not in scattered encounters, but in its most fortified, murderous form. The storm had not yet broken, but when it did, the world would never forget the sound. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Dawn broke gray and cold over the English Channel. The sea boiled with ships, thousands of them, while above, the sky trembled with the roar of aircraft. For the men crammed into landing craft, the smell of salt mixed with diesel fumes and vomit. Nerves were tight, prayers whispered. Ahead lay the beaches. On the cliffs, German soldiers waited. Machine gun crews crouched in concrete bunkers, hands on the cold steel grips of their MG42s. Belts of ammunition coiled at their feet like metallic snakes. Barrels already preheated with test bursts, spare barrels stacked nearby, gloves ready for the frantic changes that would soon come. Orders were simple: hold the line. No retreat. The first ramps dropped. Chaos. The MG42s opened fire. The sound was not single shots. It was a ripping roar, a violent tearing of the air. Allied soldiers described it as if the very atmosphere had turned into blades. Entire lines of men collapsed before taking more than a few steps. Water churned red. Helmets spun away. Rifles fell into the surf. The gun's rate of fire, over 20 bullets every second, created walls of death across the sand. Men dove into the surf, clinging to obstacles, praying the tide would shield them. The air stank of cordite, smoke, and blood. Explosions shook the ground as mortars and artillery joined in. The beach became a furnace of sound. Machine gun chatter, screams, shouted orders swallowed by the tide of noise. Yet bravery surged against the storm. American engineers crawled forward with Bangalore torpedoes, shoving long pipes of explosives under barbed wire before detonating them in deafening blasts. British infantry lobbed smoke grenades to obscure firing lanes. Some soldiers, half mad with adrenaline, simply ran forward, zigzagging through the sand, collapsing into shell craters just yards closer to the enemy. Machine gun crews inside their bunkers worked frantically. Barrels glowed cherry red, swapped out again and again. Sweat mixed with dust as assistants fed new belts into the guns, hands blistered and raw. The gunners felt powerful, but also trapped. Allied naval guns pounded the cliffs, shaking concrete, sending showers of dust down from ceilings. Every impact threatened to collapse their fortifications. Still, the MG42s did their work. Platoons were shredded. Landing craft burned offshore. For hours it seemed impossible. How could flesh and bone overcome a weapon that spat death faster than a man could blink? But slowly, inch by inch, the tide turned. A lucky shell from a destroyer punched into a bunker, silencing one MG42 nest in a flash of fire and smoke. Rangers scaled cliffs, grenades primed, storming the firing positions with desperate ferocity. Snipers found their marks, picking off assistant gunners, choking the relentless rhythm of fire. And most of all, the sheer weight of numbers. More and more men poured onto the beaches. For every squad cut down, another was already landing behind them. The Germans fired until their belts ran dry, until barrels warped, until they were overrun at bayonet point. Some fought to the last. Others surrendered, hands raised, dazed by the unstoppable wave crashing against them. By afternoon, the beaches were secure. The cost was beyond imagination. Thousands lay dead or wounded. The sand was no longer golden, but scarred black and red. Survivors stumbled forward, hollow-eyed, carrying the weight of what they had endured. The MG42 had done its work. It had proven itself the deadliest infantry weapon of the war. But on this day, it was not enough. Numbers, courage, and relentless determination had broken through. The realization spread like wildfire. The Atlantic Wall was breached. The nightmare had not ended, but the end of the war had begun. By evening on June 6, 1944, the thunder of battle had begun to fade. The beaches of Normandy, once pristine stretches of sand, were now torn landscapes, strewn with shattered landing craft, burned-out vehicles, and the still forms of thousands of men. Smoke drifted inland, carrying with it the acrid stench of gunpowder and blood. The cost was staggering. On that single day, the Allies suffered more than 10,000 casualties, with over 4,000 confirmed dead. German losses were lighter but crippling in their own way. Thousands killed, captured, or cut off as defenses collapsed. Entire MG42 teams, who only hours earlier had seemed invincible in their bunkers, were either buried in rubble from naval shells or overwhelmed in brutal close combat. Notable figures fell in the chaos. Young lieutenants who had led their men off the ramps never reached the dunes. Machine gun gunners who had fired until their barrels warped were captured, their weapons silent beside them. For countless families on both sides, Normandy would forever be the place where letters stopped arriving, where futures ended in the roar of war. Yet for all the loss, the ground had been taken. By nightfall, a fragile Allied foothold stretched across 5 beaches. The Atlantic Wall, once thought impenetrable, was broken. Behind those beaches, the roads to Cannes, to Paris, and eventually to Germany itself lay open. For the Allies, it was the beginning of liberation. For the Germans, it was the beginning of retreat, a slow collapse that no weapon, even the fearsome MG42, could halt. The machine gun had delayed, it had devastated, but it could not stop the tide. The battle for Normandy was far from over. But the world had shifted. The turning point had come at last. The MG42 became more than a weapon, it became a legend. To Allied veterans, its sound never faded. Even decades later, men who stormed the beaches or crossed the fields of France could recall the ripping chatter in their bones. It was the noise of fear, of mortality, of war at its most merciless. In military history, the MG42 forced change. Allied armies learned to adapt, using artillery, smoke, and overwhelming numbers to blunt its power. After the war, its design lived on, directly inspiring the MG3 and influencing countless modern machine guns. The brutal efficiency of stamped steel production became the standard for weapons manufacturing worldwide. But beyond tactics and engineering, the MG42 left a scar in memory. It reminded soldiers that war is not just strategy and courage. It is also the machinery of death, perfected to tear human bodies apart with terrifying speed. To the men who faced it, survival often felt less like skill and more like chance. Normandy proved that even the deadliest gun could not stop determination. Yet it also proved the human cost of such battles. The price paid in lives to silence each bunker, each barrel, each belt of ammunition. And so the MG42 endures in history, not only as the most feared gun of World War II, but as the sound of war itself. A sound so distinct, so unforgettable, that even silence can still echo with its roar.